Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Joy. So Ani Bojo, Veronica Indishnakas, Turtle Island Dojabad, and Dawa Anishinaabe Kwe Haudenosaunee. As Joy said, my name is Veronica Guido. I'm the Director of Indigenous Partnerships at Mohawk Medbuy, which is the group purchasing organization for many, many hospitals now across Canada, including all of your lovely selves. I am a lawyer by training. I have both a law degree and a master's of law, both focused in Aboriginal law, which is how Canadian law applies to Indigenous peoples, issues, and land, specifically in a section called the duty to consult, which has to do with Section 35 Constitution rights. So think title, land, rights, as well as development. So I worked most prominently in mining projects, inclusive of the Ring of Fire, which is the proposed mining project in Ontario, both for the Ontario government as well as for various First Nations who are part of that catchment area. I also have a background in criminal law. When it applies to Indigenous offenders, it's called GLADU, which comes from a very specific Supreme Court of Canada decision about Jamie Tanis Gladue, who murdered her boyfriend. And essentially what it is calling mandatorily on judges to consider all other options when possible at sentencing other than imprisonment. That doesn't necessarily mean that you just don't go to jail. In Canadian law, we have things such as mandatory minimums and maximums. So it's more about being creative and looking at restorative justice options. And I specifically only worked with Indigenous women who were exiting human trafficking. So I have an even more niche kind of look at criminal law, and that's really where I first got introduced to health and its intersections, which then led me to this current role here where I get to do lots of things, including legal education like this. But specifically my experience with health through my clients was not a single good positive thing. It was shackled to your bed in the hospital because that is where you're being detained when you're seeking medical intervention that the institutions themselves, can't do for you. It is having complete denial of human rights, essentially, through healthcare because someone is an offender. And then also because someone happens to be an Indigenous woman who may be trafficked. And that often looked like dismissal for drug seeking, even though she was trying to get help. Calling the police on her instead of having, an attendant come and see what's wrong. And often, most times, I had clients be picked up or brought back to their pimps or their traffickers through the health system when they went to go to emergency. And that has a lot to do with this lack of trust in the healthcare system. Another thing that has to do is a little bit what we're going to talk about today, which is very specific to some history as well as ongoing pieces to the residential school system. And we're going to look at what does the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mean? What does reconciliation as a word mean? What does it mean as a definition, as a responsibility? Who does it apply to? How does it link history with ongoing colonization? Because colonization is not a historic thing. It's also a current thing that's happening still to this day. And what does it mean for this hospital? What does it mean for the government? What does it mean for you as an individual person? If you were at our last Lunch and Learn, you may know that I like to teach personal with some stories, sort of like I just started, as well as family stories. And it's a little bit more at home in this conversation because I am the great-granddaughter of a residential school survivor. My great-grandmother went to a convent on the East Coast from the ages of 4 to 17. She was there. And that, as you'll learn today with the class action lawsuit that kicked off the TRC and reflecting in September, leading into wearing orange shirts on the 30th, how that all kind of relates to it. Only certain types of schools are included in that class action that we're going to talk to you about today. They don't include boarding day schools, nor do they include the convents. So what my grandmother went through is still not really known in the Canadian society, nor has there been any sort of reparations for what occurred. So as we sort of go through, this is, of course, not the most fun or lighthearted information, and if you've had any of the sessions with me already, you know I don't tend to ever sugarcoat things, and there's a reason for that. If we're not telling fact as fact, we'll continue to perpetuate the wrongs that have been happening and will continue to happen. So I really like to definitely take the stance of telling it as it is, and that's a better way to understand and hopefully continue to move forward. So we're going to start with a brief history of residential schools. For the most part in Canadian society, most people know, a foundational amount of residential schools. So we're not going to go super, super in depth here because most people know a little bit, though we are going to touch on some of the foundations and hopefully build a little bit more than maybe you were aware of already. We're then going to talk about the 60 Scoop and the class action lawsuit, which then led into the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where you get those 94 calls to action, which we'll also talk about. So what is the TRC? How did it become a thing? What was its sort of evolution? What did it come out of? What were its findings and what does that mean? And then we'll be talking a little bit at the end about the Missing Children's Project and unmarked graves. And that in itself is probably the biggest wake-up call that non-Indigenous society or Canadians who maybe don't work in this space really started to, I think, wake up to the very, very true reality of what residential schools was like. Yeah, so we've got a couple of polls just to sort of see where you're at with your foundational knowledge, how much you maybe retained from other kind of learning and education opportunities you've maybe had, whether it's personal or through your organization. I always like to have this up if you or someone you know is struggling with any of this information, be it today, be it when it's sitting with you later tonight, over the weekend, or in the future, there is help. And that is the Indian Residential School Survivor Society's number. So you can Google it. I also have it again at the end, should you feel triggered at any point. I'll also say, whether you have a direct connection to this information and history or not, this is, again, it's a dark subject matter. So if you feel at any point you need to step away, take a breather, mute me if you're online, and come back when you feel ready and safe to do so. No one's going to judge you. It's human to have these feelings, but it's utterly important that we continue to have those conversations. All right, so let's get started. I've got here, this is not a Menti question. However, you can also react if you're online. How many people have seen this emblem for Every Child Matters before? You can sort of raise your hand. Yeah, a fair amount of you, most of the room. It's becoming a pretty well-known one, and this comes actually from the TRC. And I'm gonna probably use TRC a lot as an acronym. Again, it means Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You'll learn more about that in a few slides. If you actually go to the TRC's website, you can learn about all of the individual symbolisms in this artwork, which is really, really cool to see what was sort of created. You can see right off the bat, you've got a feather representing First Nations. On the left there, you've got the Métis sash. On the right of the feather, you have the Inukshuk. So you have First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. Right in the middle, you've got some cedar underneath, which is a sacred medicine. You've got parents with children who are reaching out to each other. That could go multiple ways of what you take that to be, as well as lots and lots of circles, because circles are really symbolic of cycles, of family, of the medicine wheel, of just life in general, always is in a cyclical nature. So if you feel really called to this flag that you can sometimes see, or emblem, or symbolism, or picture, really, whatever you want to call it, I definitely recommend after the fact just Googling it and kind of reading more about the symbolism that's inside. It sort of symbolizes what we've seen maybe in the last 5 to 6 years of this sort of slogan of Every Child Matters, which really comes to the root of residential schools. Every child matters, whether they're Indigenous or not. I've got a quote here that we had in our last session, which was a lot about language. And I want to just have a quick little reminder about language use. Language is very important, it's very powerful, and you're gonna see today I've already used lots of different words. I've said I practice Aboriginal law, which applies to Indigenous peoples, land, and issues. I've already said Indian when I talked about the Indian Residential School Survival Fund. and then I said First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. As I said in the last session, whether you're here or not, don't worry, I'm going to repeat myself. For the most part, we want to be using Indigenous as our umbrella term. We all know Indian's outdated. We are starting to learn that Aboriginal is a little bit outdated too, but they still have those historic definitions and legal definitions. And in Canadian law, Aboriginal and Indian are the legal definitions, not Indigenous. So you'll see, as we're talking about very historic things that were legal in nature, you're going to hear me say the word Indian more than you probably have ever heard someone say in the last maybe 20 to 30 years. And that is purposeful, okay? Because we don't want to really necessarily change the historical nature of what we're talking about here. So just that sort of reminder again, you're going to hear me say, but it's very, very specific. I'm not saying it as an umbrella term. I'm saying it to the historic thing that we're talking about, okay? So if you want to go to our first little poll in our brief history of residential schools, I want to see as a primer how much you already know. So the question is, what year do you think or do you know that the first church-run school, church-run, not government-funded, church-run solely, opened in Canada? The options are 1831, 1887, 1903, and 1934. So I'll give you a few moments to put your votes in. 1831. 10 of you were right. So this one is a little bit tricky, right? Because it's church run. If you've done a little bit or even a lot of education in residential schools, you'll know that they were church run. And they were church run before the government caught on, and then they became church run and government funded. So you do sometimes get different dates in there, but when did the first church run school open was 1831. It is 2025. I don't do math, but if someone can do quick math, how many years ago was that? Okay, wow, speedy. I just want that to maybe sit with you for a minute, okay? Over 200 years ago. So when we're talking about the other option that gained the most, 1887, you were very close because the federal system by the government was adopted into the 1880s. However, the schools opened in the 1830s. So from 1831 to 1996, over 150,000 Indigenous children were forcefully and systematically removed from their homes and placed in what we now know as the residential school system. These schools operated across Canada, and again, they became government funded and church run. When it became government funded, it then became legally mandated that Indigenous children had to go to schools or else it was deemed illegal. This number of 150,000 is now estimated to be far below the actual amount of students who went. Many of these students never returned home. They either passed away at school, passed very recently after leaving, or didn't know where to go and went into city centers. Those that did return home often returned with lasting traumas that still impact them and their families to this day. The intent of the schools was pure and simple assimilation. It was to separate the children from their families, which meant a separation from culture, language, traditions, land, and loved ones. And as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stated in their findings, quote, thousands of students suffered physical and sexual abuse at residential schools. All suffered from loneliness and a deep longing to return home. These schools were extremely underfunded, extremely overcrowded, and the quality of education given was considered well below substandard to non-Indigenous children who went to normal school. Most of the time, children actually didn't get an education. They were instead used as laborers. So the boys were used to chop wood. They were used to do construction. The girls were used to clean and to cook and to sew. There were mass abuses of children with little to no punishment for the perpetrators. In fact, to this day, even after all of the legal cases that have gone to court, many of the churches and church foundations have protected the perpetrators. The children were not allowed to speak their own languages, and oftentimes were not even allowed to use their own names. If they did, they were often beat, if not worse. Children died most oftenly from malnutrition, curable disease, physical and sexual abuses, attempts while running away, and many by suicide. This picture here, it's a little blurry this big, but is a recent piece done by, I believe he's Cree. I'm pretty sure he's Cree, though he might be Anishinaabe, or actually he might be OG Cree. Anyways, Kent Monkman, he's a pretty famous modern Indigenous artist. For a while, if not still, this was at the AGO. And it is a depiction of more quote-unquote modern taking of children through the residential school system. So not in 1830, because as you can tell, there is mounted police. Because it was legal and it was mandated, when students were not voluntarily, in air quotes, going to school through their parents, they sent the police. And an important little tidbit of information here is that the mounted police in Canadian history only started because of Indigenous people and trying to sanction and govern them forcefully. So as you can see in this photo, you have mounted police, nuns, and priests forcibly snatching children as their parents try to keep them hidden, take them away. You see children running away. You see where my mouse actually just happens to be. This mounted police, or Joy's mouse actually, has a mounted police with a gun. I like to use these pictures a lot when I teach this because I find artwork in general just very telling, whether it is what you just saw, which is like a painting depiction, or an actual posed photograph of the realities of what happened, because you can't really hide what's in a photograph, even if you're trying. The one on the left is you see some boys who are with some smiling nuns, and the boys are not smiling. They're pretty somber in their expressions, and they're wearing paper headdresses on their heads. This one always sits with me pretty heavy because they're wearing those headdresses forcibly by the nuns as a way to mock who they were. It was not to celebrate their culture by any means. And then you have this one on the right, which are two boys praying to a pretty massive statue of the Virgin Mary. And that gets to the religious abuse that happened at schools. We can't forget that they were church-run. They were religious institutions at the end of the day. Catholic, missionary, you also had Anglican. So these Christian Catholic churches were running the schools, and part of that came from this missionary sort of history of priests coming to North America, as well as South America as well, where you have a lot of parallels in colonization here, and the forcing of religious conversion onto Indigenous folks. That is because if you look at legal philosophy, which I won't bore you too much with, but essentially, I think I said last time my arch nemesis is John Locke, who is a European philosopher. And essentially, when he was writing about labor philosophies and labor economies and who does and doesn't have a soul, he actually used Indigenous children and families in North America as his examples in his treatise on government of why they aren't people. They don't have a soul, they don't have labor economies, therefore they're savages, and they need to be saved. So that's also where this comes from. So we often think about the physical and emotional abuse. We're now more and more thinking about the sexual abuse that happened, but we often forget that there was also a lot of religious abuse that occurred as well. So my next poll is, we may or may not have given the answer away here, but when did the last residential school in Canada close? Most of you are right, 1996. I said it maybe 2-3 minutes ago. And that last school closed. It was the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. 1996 was not that long ago. Almost 30 now. Next year it'll be 30 years. So just under 30 years ago, the last residential school in Canada closed. That could mean, arguably, my sister could have reasonably gone to residential school if we had been born in Saskatchewan. That's how I like to kind of put that into perspective. She could have reasonably gone to residential school. So when we often hear, why don't you just move on? Why don't you get over it? It was in the past. It was so long ago. The 90s were not that long ago. We're talking about less than 30 years. Essentially, here's a timeline of major events and evolution of the residential school system. So from 1608 to 1760, boarding schools were first established for Indian children in New France by religious orders with the goal of turning Indian children into obedient subjects in New France. So how long ago was 1608? There we go. So 400 plus years ago, the structures that then became residential schools opened in 1608. In 1831, the Mohawk Residential School opened in Brantford. That is what would be considered your local residential school. In 1876, the Indian Act was enacted, giving the federal government the exclusive right to legislate on Indians and lands reserved for Indians. That is still the exact wording in the Indian Act to this day, because the Indian Act is still active legislation in Canada. In 1883, John A. Macdonald authorized the creation of residential schools in the West, and his Secretary of State for the provinces stated in Parliament, quote, "In order to educate the Indian children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that." 1907, Indian Affairs Medical Inspector Dr. P.H. Bryce reported nationally that the health conditions in residential schools are, quote, "a national crime." In 1920, after that national crime statement was made, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, made it legally compulsory for all Indian children aged 7 to 15 to attend residential schools, which would be government-funded and church-run, and rendered it illegal for these children to attend any other form of educational institution. 1925, the United Church of Canada is formed, transforming Methodist and Presbyterian-run schools into United-run schools. 1930, 18 institutions opened across the country, 80 institutions. The late 1950s, the, quote, half-day system starts to slow down. What was the half-day system? Half of your day you get education, which was primarily religious education. The second half of the day you do manual labor. So that starts to slow down. 1958, Indian Affairs inspectors recommend the abolition of residential schools. In the 1960s was the first time students were allowed to visit their parents and families during the holidays. Up until then, they had to stay in school all year round. So you didn't go home for the summer. You went from the ages of however to however, and that is where you lived. 1986 to 1984, many schools begin to close. The United Church, Catholic Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, Anglican Church, and Presbyterian Church begin to issue formal apologies of what occurred in residential schools. In 1996, the final report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is released, calling for a national public inquiry into the effects of residential schools. In 1996, the last residential school closes its doors. Between 96 and 98, class action lawsuits begin to be filed by formal students, including those led by Willie Blackwater and Nora Bernard. 2009, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is launched as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the largest class action in Canadian legal history. 2005, the Assembly of First Nations filed their class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada over the legacy of residential schools. In 2008, Stephen Harper apologizes in his infamous apology about residential schools. Let's do another poll. What do you think of the options there? is the name of the residential school that was in operation the longest consecutively in all of Canada. We've got Kamloops out in BC, Battleford in Saskatchewan, Cecilia Jeffrey in Northern Ontario, and the Mohawk Institute, the Mush Hole as it's called, your local residential school. Again, most of you are correct. The Mush Hole in Brantford operated from 1834 to 1970. In that time frame, it became one of the most notorious residential schools in the country. I will also say Cecilia Jeffrey's on there was also one of the most notorious. And part of the reasons it became notorious was based off of the sheer conditions inside. The children often lived with rats running over their beds. They mostly ate what we would not even consider slop for cattle and pigs for food. The girls were forced to use dirty rags when they were on their menstrual cycles. Many children died here, many children died at many schools, but in the Mush Hole in particular. And it burned down, I believe, 2 or 3 times. It does. So you can actually go and walk around. And if you go and if you walk in and you feel a really heavy energy, you'll know why for sure. Part of the notoriety of the Mush Hole in the current, when we're going to get to the missing graves shortly, but in the Missing Children's Project and communities trying to locate the unidentified graves of their children, the Mush Hole is becoming extremely difficult to be able to do that because of its burning down and multiple relocating because of it being burnt down so many times that it's becoming harder and harder to actually find where the unmarked graves may be. And that doesn't mean they're not there because survivors have been saying for hundreds of years that their classmates and their family members died at school. I should also mention more than one of their fires was quite shady, for lack of better words, when it burned down. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the 60s scoop and class action lawsuits. In that timeline, we started to sort of see about the class actions. So what was the 60s scoop? It's often stylized just like this, like the number 60 with an S. You can also spell it out as 60 scoop. But essentially, the 60 scoop started, as you saw in that timeline, schools are starting to close, the half-day system was starting to slow down. Less and less kids were being taken into schools, but the government still had the Indian problem, as Duncan Campbell Scott so famously said. So what does that look like? It starts to become mass adoption. So we're not losing the mass taking and apprehending of children, but the medium of what they're taken to has changed from institutions to white families. So during the 1960s, as the schools started to slow, more and more children were being brought into the child welfare system. And this systemic removal of children from their homes was, again, without parental consent, away from their communities and families, away from their traditional land, language, and culture. And most of the time they were taken either out of province or out of country. A lot of these students were children were all adopted into the US. And I have 2 clippings of newspaper clippings of children who were ready to be adopted out of the government's child welfare system. So we've got Sherry J. She loves to be hugged and cuddled. 3-year-old Sherry can quickly win your attention with her wide smile and big brown eyes. Then you've got Jason, a lovable little charmer, is all boy, youngster loves outdoors. Don't let his serious look fool you. 20-month-old Jason is a happy boy who enjoys playing with with both children and adults is what it says. And both of their headings say, a child is waiting. So it started mostly in the prairies and started to pick up throughout Canada as the 60s and 70s started to go on. Between 1960 and 1990, Indigenous Affairs has estimated that around 12,000 Indigenous children were adopted throughout the 60s scoop. Recent research places that number well over 20,000. As I said, many were adopted out of province, many out of country into the United States. And it's estimated that between 45 to 55% of all children apprehended in 1981 alone were adopted into the US. Some are reported to be adopted as far away as New Zealand. While some children were placed in loving homes, many survivors have reported experiencing sexual, physical, and other forms of abuse. And as a result, in the 1990s, another class action lawsuit was brought against provincial governments. These suits were in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and are still before the courts to this day. In 2009, a class action lawsuit was then brought against Canada by survivors of the 60s scoop. In 2017, the Ontario Superior Court ruled that the federal government, quote, did not take adequate steps to protect the cultural identity of on-reserve children taken away from their homes, end quote. In October 2017, an $800 million settlement was reached with the Canadian government and survivors. We've talked about two class actions, well, technically 3 or 4, but 2 major class actions. We've talked about the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which the TRC came out of. So that is the class action, the largest in Canadian legal history to this day, about treatment in residential schools. I just talked about the other class action being about 60 scoop survivors. So going to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement class action, back to that first one, back to the one about residential schools, there's only a certain amount of schools that are recognized in this agreement. Because as I said to sort of preface this all, day schools, boarding schools, convents are not included in this lawsuit. So how many schools do you think are recognized under the settlement agreement from the class action for residential schools? This is across Canada. Do you think it's 71, 118, 139, or 194? 139. So 139 residential schools are recognized under this agreement. So let that number just maybe sit, because that doesn't include, again, day schools, boarding schools, convents. So the sheer amount of actual quote-unquote schools and institutions that operate it is far more than 139. It's closer to 200, if not more. All right, let's get a little bit into the TRC coming out of this major class action lawsuit. So on June 1st, 2008, via Order in Council, which is pretty large legally as a mandate, you have to do what an Order in Council says. In reference to the mandate of Schedule N of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established. What does that mean? Part of the settlement or the agreement that came out of this class action lawsuit from residential school survivors was that the TRC would have to be created. And they have a mandate of what they need to do. And that mandate was to document the history and lasting impacts of residential schools across Canada. In the final report of the TRC, which was released in 2015, the TRC's finding was that residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. There is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages that the TRC has published between 2015, 2017, and even more recently. The most that people think about is the final report or the executive summary. That itself is I think over 300 pages. I usually have them with me, but that would have been a lot to bring all the way here. But you can download them all online, and we actually have them hyperlinked for you in a resource you're going to get after this. To distill it down to one sentence, the TRC chose that residential schools was cultural genocide. That is as distilled as they will get. You can read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of fact showing you why that is true. Another part of this settlement agreement with the TRC was a $60 million budget over 5 years to do this work that then got them this finding. A 1-year extension was granted in 2014 to allow for the completion of the TRC's mandates, extending the conclusion of the commission to 2015. June 2015, I should say. It was considered an arm's-length organization with a mandate of documenting history and impacts of the residential school system. About 70% of the schools were administered with government funds by the Catholic Church. As explained in the 2013 Spring Report of the Auditor General of Canada, a key part of the TRC mandated included, quote, creating a complete historical record as possible of the residential school system and its legacy. It was tasked also with preserving collected records documenting residential school system, and those created over the course of the Commission's work for future management as a national research center, which is in Manitoba. What happened to get all of this information over those years, if you want to head to the next slide. So over those 7 years, nearly 7,000 witnesses made statements. There was over 1,300 hours of testimony recorded, and a 6-volume report that was written at the end of it. I think it's really important to remember that this was happening in the 2010s. Many survivors have passed for multiple reasons, whether it's natural causes or something else, before their voices could be heard. So you're having 7,000 statements just from survivors in the 2010s. Some of them were family members of victims and survivors. Some were witnesses, people who worked for the schools. But primarily, they were first-hand accounts of survivors. The TRC, when they released its executive summary of findings, they also released the 94 calls to action, which we often hear probably the most in just Canadian society. The commissioners took this across Canada. So they went to major cities as well as more like of urban hubs to have these statements. And I also really want you to think about what it means to tell publicly, that's recorded, that's open to the public. There was hundreds of people at these hearings of having to tell in great detail what happened to you. Many survivors took their lives afterwards. Many took their lives before actually going to the podium because what they had maybe buried for so long, they were now having to sit with and talk about it. It wasn't mandatory. People decided if they wanted to do it or not. But it is something that did happen after the fact. And when you're thinking about that in a setting where it's voluntary, where you're going to hopefully get a good result, go back to the class action. You're subpoenaed to tell your statement. You're cross-examined while you're telling what happened to you. And that's something we often don't think about, and why the TRC's mandate was created in a sense, because witnesses, survivors, victims of the greatest kinds of abuse had to sit in a courtroom with the mic in front of them and be cross-examined on what happened to them. If you said I was X kind of abused by X person, they're gonna try and take your credibility away, because that's what lawyers do. That's their job. And that doesn't stop in a class action lawsuit. So I also like to mention that because I think it's something we maybe take for granted. That even getting this information, getting hundreds and hundreds of pages in a 6-volume report, not mentioning the executive summary that's in itself about 300 to 400 pages, what that took of people who lived through this. That was their life. So, with that in mind, let's keep going. So, what is the TRC? What are its findings? What are, the calls to action? What are your responsibilities with it? Yeah. So, children, sorry, there's a typo there. Canada, Aboriginal Peoples and Residential Schools, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's interim report. So this kind of started with the gathering of the 7,000 testimonies from survivors. Then, if you want to head to the next slide, we've got what makes up So aside from those two reports, we've then got Honoring the Truth and Reconciliation for the Future, a summary of the final report, what we have learned, Principles of Truth and Reconciliation, the 94 Calls to Action, the Survivors Speak a Report, Canada's Residential Schools, the History Part 1, Origins to 1931, which is part of Volume 1 of the final report, Canada's Residential School, the History Part 2, 1939 to 2000, Volume 2 of the final report, Canada's Residential Schools, the Inuit and the Northern Experience. Canada's Residential Schools, Volume 3, the Métis Experience. Volume 4 is Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Volume 5 is Canada's Residential Schools, the Legacy. And Volume 6, Canada's Residential School Reconciliation. I want you to look at Volume 4, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. When Kamloops came out, what was the most common reaction? It was, I'm shocked. I'm appalled. Why did no one know about this? This came out in 2015. So a lot of us, a lot of Indigenous people, especially people who work or are related to family, were actually really angered by that reaction by mostly Canadian public, but international as well. Because we've been saying for how many hundreds of years that children died at school, that they went missing at school, and that they were buried on school property. And often the burials were done by children themselves. People didn't believe us. A report comes out mandated from the largest class action in Canadian history with a mandate from government. People are still not listening. Now, post-Kamloops, there's groups of people. Some are related to church institutions, some are just their own people, who are trying to say that the anomalies found on Kamloops are fake. So when people again say, can't you just move on? Can't you just get over it? How can you when there's so many children who are still, we don't actually know. And people are now saying that it's not real. To them, I say, read the 400-page Volume 4. So what are the 94 calls to action? They're broken up in 5 different sections. So Legacy is Part 1, calls to actions 1 to 42. We've got 1 through 5, child welfare, 6 to 12, education, stuff like this, also in schools. 13 to 17, language and culture. 18 to 24, health. 25 to 42, justice. Then we've got the second section, which is reconciliation, calls 42 to 94. We've got Canadian governments and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Royal Proclamation and Covenant of Reconciliation, Settlement Agreement Parties and UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Equity for Aboriginal People in the Legal System, National Council for Reconciliation, Professional Development and Training for Public Servants, so people who work in government, Church Apologies, Education and Reconciliation, Youth Programs, Museums and Archives, Missing Children and Burial Information, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which again is in Manitoba, Commemoration, September 30th, Media and Reconciliation, Sports and Reconciliation, and I like to truly commend what Sportsnet and TSN have been doing, because truly I feel like they have been doing it in actually a very, very beautiful, genuine, what it seems quite genuine way. 92, which you often hear companies like mine say, business and reconciliation. And then the final one is newcomers. I'm gonna have you skip ahead to, so what does reconciliation mean? There we go. And what responsibilities do we have in reaching it? Reconciliation is defined as, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So, what is it and what is it not? You can go to the next slide. Reconciliation is complex and intersectional. It's critical for all Canadians, whether you were born here or not. It is a continuous process. It definitely doesn't happen overnight. It's a responsibility of all Canadians. It's about honoring the treaties, acknowledging rights, acknowledging the truth and fact of what happened, continues to happen, and ensure it ceases. Acknowledging racism and taking responsibility for not engaging, as well as to not accept others' engagement. Learning about history, learning about what continues to happen, and recognizing that intergenerational impacts of colonization do exist. Continuing to put the work in to heal, not giving up, regardless of setbacks, and an ongoing commitment to taking an active role and accepting the responsibility of living in Canada and living on treaty land. What is it not? Blame or guilt. No one's blaming you. No one's telling you you should feel guilty for this. That you didn't do it, right? But it's also not a single action or statement. It's not coming to one lunch and learn and saying, I have accomplished all reconciliation. It's not a one-time thing. Not something that happens overnight. It's not a trend. It's not a box to be ticked off, nor is it a single action or statement. Let's go to our last check-in poll. Something that kind of ties into where we're coming up to on the calendar, even though I know it's only the 3rd, but still. What it looks like maybe for people to do some of those things of what reconciliation means and is. So what was the name of the child whose orange shirt was taken from them on their first day of residential school? Was it Harry Laforme, Phyllis Webstad, Murray Sinclair, or Roseanne Archibald? All famous Indigenous people, by the way. They're not made up names. You guys got it. Phyllis Webstad. Absolutely. Harry Laforme was the first Indigenous justice to sit on the Ontario Superior Court and is a dear friend of mine. Murray Sinclair was the head commissioner of the TRC, and Roseanne Archibald was a former AFN chief, Assembly of First Nations. So this is Phyllis Webstad, and she had her beautiful brand new orange t-shirt that her grandmother bought her taken away on the first day of residential school. And she tells the story of how she was stripped naked at the school, all her clothes were taken away, anything that was identifiable to her was taken away, and that's not new, even though she's still alive and well, and she went to school in probably the 70s. Students have always had their clothes taken, had their hair cut off, had their name changed. And so she started to kind of heal with her own trauma and her own experiences by wearing an orange shirt on the day that she had it taken away. So we now have Orange Shirt Day on the 30th. And you see another very recognizable Every Child Matters emblem that you probably have seen a lot. But we have to ensure that when we're wearing an orange shirt, it's not performative. It's not that single action. It's not that single thing. It's not expecting things to change. Why do we wear it? It's to raise awareness, to start conversations. Perhaps it's to show solidarity. So it's not a trend, right? That's one of the things that reconciliation is not. So if you're finding putting on an orange shirt is tiresome or not meaningful for you, maybe reflect on that. Maybe there's something else that calls to you. No one's forcing you to wear an orange shirt. And in fact, if you don't feel that connection to it, I would argue you should probably not wear it, because then it does become performative and you're not actually doing what it's supposed to do. Maybe something else sits with you better. So to wrap up, I want to talk really briefly about the Missing Children Project. Again, I already mentioned Kamloops Discovery, what's sort of been happening there. So the TRC contributed to not only educating the public about the reality of residential schools, but also led to creating other organizations such as the Missing Children's Project. Over the course of residential school, thousands of children died as a result of disease, suicide, malnutrition, and more. Many young girls died from childbirth. In 1917, the death rates stopped being documented by the Department of Indian Affairs, which is why we don't actually know how many children passed while at schools. So the Missing Children's Project is an organization that's dedicated to identifying the children who died during their times at school. And it's done through intensive research, as well as analyzing different conditions the students were facing, using data, using the ground-penetrating technology that we now have. And to tie that all together, that's my niece and nephew. They're bigger now. Gigi is 3 and Miles will be 5 in November. But that's them a few summers ago in their orange shirts, and Gigi has some of her regalia on. I know, she's so cute. The middle photo is me at her age with my great-grandmother who went to the convent on the East Coast. And then the final photo is my great-great-grandmother on her territory in Oka in Quebec. So why does this work need to continue? Why should we maybe wear that orange shirt? Why should we continue talking? Why should we support the Missing Children's Project and other forms of work? Because it's an important symbol of remembering. It's an important reminder that the work is nowhere near done yet, and that there's still other truths that are very much in the shadows. What happened at day schools? That's a class action that's currently going through the class finding. So who categorizes as in the class? Convents, litigation, burials, and why it's a reminder of why this work is so important and why maybe we should continue to wear orange or support Indigenous artists, listen to podcasts, watch documentaries, come to events like this, whatever it might be. So to end, I want to pause for a moment to honor, reflect, and remember, however that means to you. And I know we are getting really tight on time, but I'm happy to stay around for a little bit if anyone has questions or comments. And I'll leave the crisis line on the screen in case someone may need it or know someone in their life who's a loved one or a coworker or a friend who may at some point, especially during the month of September, perhaps need some support and some help. You can also donate to them. They are a charity, so you can also donate if you have the means or the want to. So with that, I'll say Chi Miigwech for having me a second time, for having this more in-depth conversation about the TRC in residential schools, because I know sometimes it can be a little bit more surface level. So thank you for taking the time for coming today. Same for you all online. If you ever have questions as you sit with this information tonight, over the weekend, the next couple of weeks, throughout the month, you can always reach out to Joy, who's more than welcome to share my information with you, because my job is to support your hospital, which is supporting all of you in your corporate reconciliation work as well as your own individual. So thank you so much. If you want to put it maybe back on the line just for a few moments, just in case. And if you are online and have a question, feel free to type it into the chat, or you can send an email as well afterwards. And if anyone here has a question, feel free.
But please join me in thanking Veronica for me.
My pleasure. So like I said, I'm happy to...